Some of us are addicted to the news just now. Some of us avoid the news. Or at least we limit how many times we check the news because it's easy to get fixated or overwhelmed by bad news at the moment. The phrase that some people use for this is doom scrolling, a tendency to constantly scroll down the page for more and more updates, or constantly refresh the page to see more and more updates. But it's not really great for anyone's mental health at the moment, and often you end up feeling lower than you did when you started. There are stories of good news in there, and I am one of the first to look for these and then to pass them on to people. These past few days and weeks in particular, there have been stories of good news that have been to do with world leaders changing and opportunities there, but also the news of vaccines. Vaccines right now are good news. I believe, in fact, actually some of us have been getting our jags in this community this very morning. As the whole vaccine rollout has been progressing, people have been waiting to hear news about the vaccine. So they've been waiting for phone calls or for letters. And this has brought all sorts of excitement and also all sorts of questions. In the ancient Near East, in the time of the Roman Empire, near the end of the 1st century, letters were also eagerly anticipated. They brought news that you couldn't get in other ways. Hopefully, it would be good news. One of those letters is collected for us at the back of this collection of books we call the Bible. It's known as the Revelation. It's got an interesting reputation. Some people think it's full of secrets. Some people think it's full of bad news. Some people think it's a bit of a fantasy horror story made to frighten people into behaving. As I read this letter, as I work my way through it, and it's the kind of letter that would have been made to read out loud, what I find is that the author of this letter doesn't seem to agree with any of those assumptions. At heart, he's someone who cares about his listeners. He's an artist. He's inspired, and despite the fact he himself is locked down, he's inspired to write a letter to be read out loud, to inspire, to uncover, he says. He doesn't want to hide things, he wants to reveal things, to remind people of things, to bring hope and comfort. Right in the middle, in chapter 14, he's in the middle of describing a set of pictures and ideas that involve a dragon, which in these Jewish stories is a big symbol of everything that works against God's project, sometimes also described as the accuser or the Satan. And this dragon is attacking another image of a woman. And again, in these stories, the idea of the woman is the idea of the Jewish people themselves, of Israel, the Hebrews, God's people. Everyone who joins in and responds to God's creation project. What this story seems to be saying between the woman and the dragon is that the accuser, in this case maybe the empire, that's been working to wreck or attack what God is doing, has failed. In John's image, the dragon has failed and the woman survives. And now the image is just of something that has lost, but is now a bit peeved. And along with his sidekicks, a couple of beasts can smash things up a bit until things are finally put to rights. And so the dragon stands on the shore of a sea, peeved. John's listeners would have been sympathising with how they feel as they see the empire around them still put so much pressure on them. So then, in this chapter, what the writer, and we call him John, turns from reminding his listeners of, because he's reminded them that the dragon is lost, and all that remains now is for this project to get back on track and things to be put to rights. He turns from looking backwards to looking forwards, and now he describes an image of a lamb, which again in these stories is obviously Jesus of Nazareth, standing on a mountain with a huge crowd of people. A suspiciously neat number of people. At first glance, this might seem like an army gathered to fight against the beasts. Let's look at what's written here. It's an image of Mount Zion, and Zion is another word for Jerusalem, and it's really just another symbol, another image of where God is, God's presence. And this is, remember, a contrast. So looking back, there's a dragon standing on the shore, but looking forward, there's a lamb on a mountain. Here is Jesus of Nazareth, the living Jesus that John is seeing, standing where God is, with a huge crowd who are singing, worshipping their God. And this is what they were made for. That neat number, 144,000, is one we've seen before in this letter. It's a multiple of 12 times 12 times 1,000. And it seems that John, and he's used these numbers, sees the 12 as the 12 tribes of Israel, a typical symbol in these stories. The second 12, the 12 disciples of Jesus, representing the new Jesus movement, part of the whole response to God. And then times 1,000, the idea of the big, huge number for everyone. 12 tribes, 12 disciples, all God's people. It's not a literal number. It's not a limited number at all. It just means everyone who responds to God. And here they are. They're not an army ready to fight. They are singing, worshipping. We then get a quick look at that description of them, and we might look at it and we might panic a little bit and think, well, okay, Jesus followers then need to avoid sex, avoid getting married, avoid women, and not tell any lies. Well, don't panic. Because this, remember, is about pictures and about symbols. Plenty of Jesus followers are married. The scriptures, the Jewish scriptures, have plenty to say about how great a gift family, marriage and sex is. A recurring theme in these stories, however, is the idea that adultery and unfaithfulness is a symbol of idolatry, of God's people going after other gods. The language here of first fruits, the language of being blameless, is the language of the temple. The Jewish temple system of connecting with God, of offering yourselves to God. The first fruits of your harvest were dedicated to God in gratitude. The lambs and other animals that were brought for sacrifice were offered to God blameless, spotless. This is just the writers mix and match word pictures, jamming together these images of a living Jesus leading worship with all his people. He then goes on to pile on a few other images. The first group are about angels or messengers, and he sees them delivering news. Notice that the news that's being delivered is something called the eternal gospel. The word gospel, as we've seen time and time again, literally means good news. Remember I said that some people think this letter's a scary horror story, maybe written to frighten you into behaving. But what does the writer actually say, though? He says this is good news. And not just good news for a few people, he layers it on for every nation, for every tribe, for every language, and every people. This is pretty comprehensive. This is good news for all. Another angel messenger has news about Babylon. Now, Babylon was a real place. Babylon was a real empire. But you won't be surprised to know, we're getting the hang of this now, it's another symbol. Babylon was the empire that destroyed the Israelite people, that carried them into slavery at the end, around about 600 years before Jesus' life and death and resurrection. Throughout their scriptures, Babylon represents the opposition, the accuser, the Satan, the forces that push back. In these kinds of letters, it's often Rome that Babylon represents. But the good news, and remember it's good news that this messenger has, is that Babylon has fallen. Or he's looking into the future, will fall. There will be an end to the empire, to the temptations, to the pressure to follow other ways and fake gods, to all the strategies that the accuser uses to try and muck things up while they can. Remember, they've already failed, says the writer. The dragon is standing peeved on the shore. A last angel brings more good news about God's fury or God's wrath. Wait a minute. Is that good news? Is this then the angry God that we maybe expected this letter was going to be all about? Well, again, as we've seen in the first chapters, because this is chapter 14, and in all of these ancient stories, God's wrath, this God's fury, is always specific, targeted. It's not the thrashing around rage of something or someone that wants revenge. This is a wrath, a fury that is about dealing with a specific evil that attacks his project, putting it then to rights, judgment, justice. And why is that good news? Well, it's good news for the project. It's good news for creation. It's good news for God's creatures. It's good news for God's children. That the final stage of this story is a vision of God putting things to rights. Like the vaccine. This is good news for all people, but maybe bad news for the virus. Like treatments like radiotherapy or chemotherapy, they are good news for patients, for sufferers, for survivors, but bad news for the cancer. The writer's final set of pictures in this section is about harvest. Aha, well maybe this is the horror part, because there's a sickle, so that means a reaper, and maybe this is the grim reaper. Hang on a second though. What is, let's think, harvest all about? Is harvest about fear? And in particular, let's maybe think about what harvest would have meant in the first century. Well, when I lived on a farm, harvest just meant a lot of hard work. But harvest really, actually, is a huge time of joy, of celebration. Harvest means fruit. It means product. It means food. It means profits. It means wine. It means well-being. We still annually celebrate Harvest Thanksgiving. Harvest is something to look forward to, especially for everyone who is a partner in the project. This is when all the work pays off. This is what things have been leading to. The only parts that harvest is not good news for are things like weeds and pests and enemies. This letter, time and time again, reminds its listeners that this letter is not written to bring fear or misery or to frighten people. This is a letter of hope, a letter of comfort, but also a letter of warning. Get too involved in the fake empire. Get too involved in among the weeds. Get too seduced into ways of working against God's creation project, against who you were made to be. And that might not feel like such good news when God puts things to rights. And so this part ends with an image of an ocean of blood. 1,600 stadia sized ocean of blood. Well, surely an ocean of blood is the scary part. But let's look at the words that the writer is inspired to choose. This image happens outside the city. Jesus of Nazareth's followers know that what happened outside the city is that criminals were executed, and that's where Jesus was crucified. And the writer is playing with these numbers. 1600 is 40 times 40. And in these stories, 40 is a symbol of the time of testing. 40 years spent in the wilderness, 40 days in the desert. The Jesus story is about a God who gave himself as the ultimate sacrifice of self-giving love, so that every nation, every tribe, every language, every people could be part of what God has always been doing. In this image, there is a huge amount of blood. There is, it seems, enough blood. Enough blood to deal with everyone and everything. It seems to me that this letter keeps coming back to the same theme. That this is not a letter of doom, and we scroll through it feeling lower and lower. This is a story of good news. Like a vaccine. Good news for the people. Maybe not so good news for the virus. And John writes again here, for maybe the 7th time so far he's repeated this, that what this calls for above everything else is patient endurance.